So, we need to talk about one of the biggest creative fights happening right now. It's human artists versus these incredibly powerful AI image generators, which it turns out were trained on their work. This is a huge story about what inspiration even is, what technology is capable of, and what it really means to create something new. It all kicks off with a personal story about grief and spirals into this massive global legal war. Let's get into it. Everything really starts with a human being. This quote is from Chris Kashtanova, who created a graphic novel called Zarya of the Dawn. After her grandmother passed away, she worked through her grief by building this world, this story. And listen to how she describes her character. Just a regular person, tired, needs naps, no superpowers. You can feel that this isn't just a comic book, right? It's a deeply personal, emotional journey that ended up becoming art. And that right there brings us to the absolute heart of this whole conflict. What is inspiration? Is it that messy, emotional, human thing that Kashtanova just described? Or can you boil it down to a mathematical process, just analyzing and reassembling data points? That is the fundamental disagreement we're going to unpack today. Okay, so to really understand this battle, we have to look at how these AI models are even built. And if you ask the artists, it all begins with something they call the Great Data Heist. Get a load of this number, 5.85 billion. That's how many image and text pairs are in just one dataset, called Leon 5B. Now, this thing was put together by a German nonprofit that just scraped the public internet for everything it could find. And then, for-profit companies took that massive dataset and used it to train AI models like Stable Diffusion. And the kicker? It was all done without the consent, the credit, or any compensation for the millions of artists and creators whose work was in there. Artists and researchers actually have a name for this whole process. They call it data laundering. Now, that's a pretty heavy term, but they argue it's dead on. It describes taking all this copyrighted, kind of dirty data, pushing it through a super complex technical pipeline, and having it come out the other side as a clean, commercial AI product, with all its original sources completely scrubbed. So here's the playbook they're talking about. Step 1, you scrape billions of images from the web, no permission asked. Step 2, you bundle them all up into a giant dataset. 3, you use that to train your AI model. Now, here's the clever part. Step 4, the model doesn't save JPEGs. Instead, it creates these super compressed mathematical versions of the art. The lawsuit calls them latent images. And finally, step 5, the commercial AI uses those mathematical blueprints to generate totally new pictures from scratch. Okay, now you gotta see this, because this is the core technology. It's called diffusion. It's everything to the artist's argument. Look at that top row. The AI is trained by taking a real image and just destroying it. It adds random digital noise until it's nothing but static. The only thing the AI learns to do is how to perfectly reverse that process. See the bottom row? It learns to rebuild the original image from that chaos. So artists argue this isn't learning the idea of a cat. It's learning the exact pixel-by-pixel recipe to perfectly copy a specific cat it was shown. And that right there is the central legal fight in a nutshell. Are these AIs just really smart students, learning abstract concepts? Or are they just 21st century plagiarism machines, storing compressed copies of everything they were fed? Let's see how this plays out in court. So in January of 2023, a group of artists, led by Sarah Anderson, decided to fight back. They filed a massive class action lawsuit against the big players, Stability AI, Midjourney, and even DeviantArt for its AI tool. And their core claim was incredibly simple. Training your models on our art without asking is copyright infringement. Period. This really gets down to the fundamental disagreement. The artists are saying, look, that AI model file itself contains compressed, latent copies of our work. It's just a really, really high-tech collage tool. The tech companies fire back, no way, the model doesn't store any images at all. It just learns abstract statistical patterns. But here's the thing, research has actually shown these models can and do memorize their training data. And they're capable of spitting out nearly identical copies, which really undermines that whole defense. But like everything with this topic, the technical side is complicated. In a related case over in the UK, the court found that the model weights, that's the core of the AI, they don't literally store pixel-for-pixel copies or even compressed JPEGs. So what this suggests is that the copy isn't like a file you can find. It's more like a set of instructions, a recipe for how to perfectly rebuild the original art from math. So, because the tech isn't making a simple one-to-one copy, the tech industry planted its flag on a legal defense called fair use. They're basically arguing that using copyrighted work to train an AI is transformative. It's not about stealing the original, they say, it's about creating a totally new tool. Kind of like how Google can show you a little thumbnail of an image when you do a search. So, in the middle of all this legal chaos, everybody was basically waiting for the referee to make a call, for the highest authority on copyright in the United States to weigh in. And in January 2025, they finally did.
The date was January 29th, 2025. The U.S. Copyright Office dropped its long-awaited report. And this wasn't just another opinion. This was a foundational statement on how American copyright law was going to handle generative AI.
And their conclusion? It was completely unambiguous. Human authorship is a bedrock of copyright ability. In other words, if a human didn't make it, you can't copyright it. The office made it crystal clear. Under U.S. law, a machine cannot be an author. The report then laid out some really clear rules. A piece of art made 100% by AI? Nope, no copyright. What if you write a super detailed, beautiful text prompt? Sorry, not enough. The Copyright Office says that's just an idea, and ideas aren't protectable. Only the parts of a final work that a human actually meaningfully creates, like through editing or collage, can be protected. Now, using AI as a tool, like a fancy filter in Photoshop, that's totally fine. But the AI itself gets zero credit as an author. So the Copyright Office's ruling cleared up who owns the new stuff coming out of AI. But it didn't solve the much bigger fight over the data used to train the models in the first place. In fact, that conflict was only just getting started, and the stakes were getting much, much higher. That first lawsuit from independent artists, it was just the first domino. Soon after, you had major authors like George R.R. Martin joining lawsuits against OpenAI for using their books to train language models. And then, by mid-2025, the real heavyweight showed up. Companies like Disney, Universal, you name it, they all filed suits, saying that AI generators were illegally replicating their most iconic and heavily protected characters. For artists, this whole thing is an existential threat. First, these models are now direct commercial competitors, built on the unpaid work of the very people they're trying to replace. Second, you have features popping up that can perfectly mimic a living artist's unique style, on demand. And third, digital stores are just being flooded with synthetic, AI-generated junk, bearing actual human creators under a mountain of algorithmically made content. But artists are not just fighting this in courtrooms. They're fighting back with their own tech. Tools called Glaze and Nightshade basically act like a poison pill for data scrapers. They make tiny changes to an image's pixels that are completely invisible to you and me. But for an AI model that scrapes that image, the data is corrupted. It's a kind of digital sabotage, right? It teaches the model that a dog is actually a cat, making the stolen data completely useless. And that leaves us with this final, massive question. As our digital world gets completely saturated with infinite, instantly made synthetic content, what happens to the value of something that was actually made by a human? Maybe, just maybe, in an ocean of algorithms, the verifiable touch of a human hand, with all its mistakes, its emotions, and its personal story, maybe that becomes the most valuable thing there is.